First of all, I would like to thank the authorities of the Center for Development Economics for this brilliant organization of the 50th anniversary, and of course, for the honor of inviting me to be a speaker. When I attended the first class immediately after my arrival at the Center of Development Economics back in 1968, 42 years ago, the case study to be discussed in class was the foreign exchange gap and the distortions to the economy generated by the Argentine currency overvaluation of 1948-1954. Professor John Sheehan commentaries and the later discussion paper, Import Substitution as a Development Strategy, written by Henry Bruton, were demolishing and brilliant. In fact, all Professor R. Williams were able to present to the class case studies where development issues such as comparative advantage, shadow prices, competitive equilibrium, cost-benefit analysis, resource allocation, and even simple econometrics were presented with impressive vitality, freshness, and force in a way that I never saw again, even though I later had the opportunity to review many of those concepts in such renowned places such as Penn and Harvard. My first contact with the Williams approach to development economics impressed me so much that I decided to focus heavily on the subject in my subsequent studies. During the 80s, the Argentine economy experienced the maladies of a 20% drop in GDP per capita, 20% drop in GDP per capita, and a hyperinflation that reached a rate of 4,982% for the year 1989. Those disasters set the stage for important policy reforms. The public strongly advocated for them. Moreover, the timing of the collapse of the Argentine economy coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1989, the glory of the most extreme liberal capitalism was at its pinnacle. Thus, Milton Friedman's simple policy recommendations of privatize, and privatize were assumed by President Menem and his Minister of Finance, Dr. Domingo Cavallo, a Harvard PhD. And in fact, many of those actions gave successful results. Public services and utilities became efficient after 2 or 3 years, and more importantly, the inflation rate dropped to 2% per year only, immediately. But 2 fatal and important flaws were committed in the whole process of policy reforms. The first was the fixing of the exchange rate forever, as in the gold standard, by law of Congress, at a level that in real terms was half of its equilibrium rate. In other words, the equilibrium rate of exchange was 2 pesos per dollar, but the new law of Congress enacted 1-to-1 to the dollar. As in the gold standard, the central bank could issue only 1 peso to the extent that it could buy $1. Instead of the gold standard of the 19th century, we experienced with an equally rigid dollar standard. In fact, the Argentine monetary system enforced during the 1991-2001 has been inspired not by Milton Friedman, but in the theory of the supply-side economics. This theory, sponsored by economists like Robert Mundell Arthur Laffer and Robert Barro, holds that the true cause of inflation is the currency devaluation. So, in order to fight inflation, supply-siders advise keeping the nominal exchange rate fixed. Moreover, in order to make a stronger point, inducing rational expectations about the future, the fixing of the exchange rate must be established by law of Congress, as referred previously. Obviously, also, the Barro-Ricardian theory on fiscal deficit was adopted. That meant that if the government went into debt, the wise and rational private sector would save, compensating for the government deficits. Thus, the government issued abundant foreign debt for the dual purposes of providing dollars to the central bank to finance the balance of payment deficits, and at the same time, those dollars converted into newly issued pesos served the purpose of financing the fiscal deficit. The expansive effect of fiscal deficit covered through external debt was essential to counteract the depressing effects on economic activity of currency overvaluation. The inevitable result of these policies was an ever-growing external debt, very large balance of payment deficits, high interest rates, and worst of all, unemployment rates of 20% that, when added with underemployment, both together reached up to 40%. Thus, the social unrest generated by supply-side economics became so high that they brought about the resignation of President de la Rúa back in December of 2001. But in early 1991, not only supply-siders were able to convince Congress for fixing forever the nominal exchange rate by law, additionally, they legally encouraged the expansion of local dollar deposits and lending in dollars to local people and enterprises, when in fact they received their income in pesos, the local money supply. This institutional setup implied that Argentina had no lender of last resort for its local economy from 1991 to 2001, simply because the Argentinian central bank could not issue dollars. It could only issue and lend pesos to the banking system. But the banking system had legally to pay back their deposits in dollars. Interesting enough, the finance ministers and central bank governors that advised President Menem and de la Rúa to implement this kind of gold standard plus local dollar deposits were all graduated as PhDs in Harvard, Minnesota, or Chicago. Then after this, no one holding a title of Harvard, Minnesota, or Chicago will ever be Minister of Finance in Argentina. Based on the Williams body of economic policy thinking, which recommended a careful setting of the big macroeconomic prices, such as the exchange rate, the interest rate, and the wage rate as a basis for long-term economic growth, I wrote and published, at the time, more than 100 newspaper articles and 4 books criticizing the new supply-side economics after year 1991. Unfortunately, for almost 10 years, I was a vox clamantis in deserto. I was speaking loudly, but to the Sahara Desert. I thought that Mr. Cavallo and his flock of 100 economists should have attended Williams before going to Harvard or Chicago. If that had been the case, they would not have advice for the currency overvaluation and for local dollar bank deposits. As I said before, all these policies ended up in 2001 in a 10% drop in GDP, 40% of unemployment, a default of external debt. In addition, since Mr. Cavallo was again the finance minister in 2001, the bomb he designed exploded in his own hands. So it is very important what was said previously in this conference about humility. Humility. At the beginning of 2002, a new president, Mr. Eduardo Dualde, was appointed by Congress. His Minister of Finance, Mr. Roberto Lavagna, set a competitive exchange rate accompanied by managed floating. In addition, he was able to implement a policy of strong fiscal surpluses. Moreover, he conveniently renegotiated our external debt. That combination of policies worked wonders in terms of economic growth rates and employment, lasting up to early 2007, including part of the first term of the newly elected president, Nestor Kirchner. Unfortunately, those judicious policies were abandoned early in 2007. At the time, year 2007, a new brand of populism destroyed the cost of living index to hide the new inflation brought about by the policy of salary increases not accompanied by increased productivity. The exchange rate became no longer competitive because it had been eroded by the growing inflation. As you can see, the mania of fighting inflation by keeping the nominal exchange rate almost constant emerged again and again, as if the supply siders were newly in power. Public utility rates were fixed also at wrong levels, covering only 30% of the cost. Unfortunately, a new economic crisis may result in year 2012, and growth may take again the traditional pattern of stop and go. As you can see, the economic cycle in Argentina keeps no major connection with the US cycle. Now, in year 2010, the growth rate will be 9%. Probably the growth rate in 2011 will be 4%. In 2009, we had a drop, not revealed by the official statistic, but by the true statistics, of minus 3%. Our economy now is more connected with the Chinese economy, because our economy exports a lot of soybeans and grain to China. And since China has a tremendous growth rate, the demand for food and foodstuff keeps our prices, the prices of our exports, very high, and this helps very much our economy. So our cycle is rather independent of the US one. But blaming only the economic policies of the last 20 years for Argentina's backwardness today, in 2010, would be reductionism. In the second half of the 20th century, Argentina tried with many economic policies, in fact, too many, and in few occasions they were the right ones. The true deep cause of our decadence is the so-called spoil system in public administration. Argentina has a type of Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson was a president of the United States in the 19th century, supporting the wrong theory that the political party winning the elections should provide all public administration jobs, even the mailman. But finally, at the end of the 19th century, the US rejected the spoils system with the enactment of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which established a merit system for appointment. But in Argentina, a special type of spoils system was established in the 20th century, and it is still in force. The president elected by popular vote has the right to appoint his own people in all public administration jobs. He can appoint not only his minister, which is obvious, but also directors and deputy directors and even all menial public jobs. And especially, he is careful in appointing the financial director of each ministry. In Argentina, there is no strict professional civil service appointed through examinations and promoted through long-term careers. A stable civil service based on merit is key to obtain long-term state policies, to promote human capital formation, and for institution building. That occurs in all developed countries. The opposite, the spoils system, is a sure path to decadence. As a result of the spoils system, is that the result of the spoils system is that the politician tackling the presidency has a complete control of the public administration budget, so he can use public money to keep himself or his own cronies, or even his wife, always in power. The result of the spoils system was that all presidents tried to perpetuate his power simply because the treasury of the public budget, which is about $100 billion, is such a large gift that it cannot and should not be donated to the opposing party. Thus, the Republican Democratic alternancy in politics becomes extremely difficult. Then, under the spoils system, fraud in elections to keep the incumbent in power may occur. The fraud could adopt many forms, such as changing the ballot boxes, altering the election date, appointing too many cronies, giving a general rise in salaries the months previous to the election day, or controlling newspapers, television, and the media in general. Fortunately, there is a growing awareness of the necessity of resolving these problems in today's Argentina's politics. Many presidential candidates for the 2011 elections have promised to tackle the issue. If Argentina were to resolve this problem, she could easily regain her old position among the 10 more developed countries as the one she had 100 years ago, back in 1910. Thank you very much.